Mark Ellison left before dawn, the highway unspooling in a dark ribbon between fields glazed with frost. The world had been dusted in an inch of powder that made the streetlights look like isolated lanterns on a winter sea. He hummed along with a station playing soft jazz, keeping one hand on the wheel and the other on a travel mug that had long since gone lukewarm. The city he taught in still slept. In a few hours a bell would ring and sophomores would shuffle into his classroom to face a test on 1984. And he'd say something about the danger of trading truth for comfort. And half of them would groan. The familiarity of it all kept him warm. He thought about the people he loved. Lucy had gone to bed with an upset stomach and a nest of blankets pulled up to her chin. She had a spelling list due Friday, and he'd promised to quiz her if she felt better. Diane had said she would work from home to keep an eye on their daughter, and she'd squeezed his hand at the door in that comforting way of hers, the one that said they had ridden out storms before and would again. Mark had almost stayed. He had a stack of essays to grade, though, and a test to administer, and they needed every paycheck this month. Rent had gone up again, so he drove. The owl came out of nowhere, a white collapse of wings, a sound like hail at close range, then glass. The windshield starred, went black with a spiderweb of fractures, and the car pitched left. A steel guardrail became a gray blur. Tires scrubbed and screamed. The world folded around him. Something metal tore. The radio fizzed. Mark tried to steer, tried to brake, failed at both, and thought, not for the first time, that people never felt as much like paper as they did when the world bent. Everything went quiet. His head floated, then settled at a crooked angle that didn't hurt but should have. He became aware of being upside down. The car had flipped and was resting on its roof. The world translated into slices of red through shards of glass. The radio changed stations by itself and settled on the tail end of a trumpet solo. Something in the horn's final note mourned him. Headlights swept the wreckage. A second car slowed on the shoulder. A door opened. Cold fell into the dark interior with the precision of a blade as the air moved. Mark blinked through grit and blood and saw, framed by a broken window, a girl step out. He thought, at first, she was a teenager with a dyed job taken too far. Then she moved and came into the pale wash of a headlight. And the hair wasn't dye. It was white as salt. Her skin had the same color as the road salt on the guardrail. When she lifted her eyes to the car and looked in at him, he saw no whites, no iris. The eyes were wells, not black like pupils, but black like a depth that refused the sky. The radio cut off mid-sentence, opened into a room tone of static, then found a voice that sounded like every midnight DJ he'd ever heard, smooth with the kind of cheer that refused tragedy. Seems like we're having some technical difficulties. The voice said, stay tuned for more. In the meantime, our lucky caller is Mark Ellison. His phone buzzed somewhere above him, which meant somewhere below him, given gravity's new opinion. The girl didn't glance toward it. She reached an arm into the car, and though her wrist was thin as a reed, it cut the cold like a blade. Mark saw the faint shadow of markings on her skin. They weren't letters so much as handwriting that had been made into a bracelet, a language that couldn't be parsed but still felt like it was about him. She placed a hand on his cheek. The world flickered. Mark looked toward the road and saw himself. Not the man he imagined. The man he was. Short brown hair. A tie that Lucy had picked for him last Father's Day, pale pink. Stupid and brave in a world that loved gray. The tie hung lopsided over a shirt turned a darker color by blood. The man outside the car had a neck bent and a face that had been polite for years and finally gave up the job. People say you know your body when you see it. That's not true. He didn't know that man, but he couldn't deny him either. The radio voice returned, strained joviality smoothing over a crack. Oh, folks, I'm getting a note from upstairs. It appears our Mark is not eligible for our program. But don't worry. We've sent a representative to rectify this situation. On to our next lucky caller. The girl looked down at her hand as if she were surprised it existed. She looked back at Mark. In that moment, something flickered through the wells of her eyes. An echo of puzzlement that made her look more like a person and less like a verdict. The expression vanished. She pressed her palm again to his cheek. And the world stuttered, buffered, caught up. And he came to in a hospital room with the light through the blinds drawn in bars across a tile floor. He had a concussion. The doctor spoke in sentences that wanted to sign waivers. Minor lacerations. Head wound. Observation. His wife stood to his right and their daughter to his left. And both of them were trying not to cry. The sympathy on their faces seemed external to him, as if compassion were weather. He touched his cheek where the girl had placed a hand. There was no mark. He went home with instructions to rest and to avoid screens, and to call if anything felt wrong. Everything felt wrong by degrees that were hard to measure until the ordinary came to meet them. The apartment was the same one they had had for 10 years. Carpet that had been cleaned often enough to accept its stains. A couch that had cost too much for what it was, but was still where they watched movies together. Diane propped Lucy with pillows and pressed the back of her hand to their daughter's forehead and told Mark to sleep. He agreed because that seemed like a sentence a responsible person would say. He lay down in their bedroom and closed his eyes. He didn't sleep so much as unspool. He woke to a knock. Diane came in and smiled. Weary. Beautiful. A little worried. Dinner was spaghetti and meatballs because spaghetti and meatballs fixed most problems you could name. He sat at the table with his family and lifted a fork. The pasta was heavy in his mouth and tasted like paste. The sauce had been sharpened by years of practice and a splash of wine. But it hit him like something spoiled. He managed to smile anyway. The one you give when the polite thing will do. It didn't ring true in his own ears. The meatballs were different. They were, to his surprise, perfect. He had always been the sort of person who wrapped a napkin around a burger at a cookout, avoiding grease. Now the meat made his tongue sing. He kept spooning meatballs onto his plate, ignoring the way his stomach tightened. Listening to Lucy talk about a book she was reading in a cadence that hopped and dipped. He loved the sound of her voice. Tonight it scratched. He tried to blame the stabbing in his temples and the small sun burning behind his eyes. He excused himself early and lay down again. Pain had been waiting in the dark and stepped out to greet him. At some point he floated up through an awful sleep and found himself in the bathroom. The lights off and the door cracked so the hall light made a thin trapezoid of gold. He ran water into a plastic cup and shook 2 pills into his palm. He swallowed and touched his face in the mirror's half-reflection. The bandages tugged. Itching replaced pain, then returned as both. He woke at dawn with a taste in his mouth like metal gone bad. When he stood, his knees fizzed. He padded to the kitchen. Hunger shook him. He opened the refrigerator and let the light hurt his eyes. There was a package of bacon near the back. The thought of the taste made him weak. The thought of cooking felt impossible. He tore open the plastic and a smell broke over him. In the time it took to ask himself what he was doing, a firm, cold strip filled his mouth. He swallowed. It slid. Heat traveled from his throat into his stomach, then up behind his teeth. He stood at the counter with the rest of the package in his hands and felt like a man who had been handed a task by something older than his name. He forced himself to cook the rest. The fat snapped. He ate half while it cooled. Diane came out while he was washing his hands and tucked herself against him. And the scent of her shampoo made an ache start in the back of his throat. She kissed him and didn't comment on the heat of the frying pan or the smear of grease on his shirt. She took a plastic tub from the fridge and grabbed her keys. She was late. He wanted to tell her he was scared. He did not want to hear what he sounded like saying it. After she left, and after Lucy hustled out with a glittery backpack bumping her knees, and a wave over her shoulder. Mark stood alone in the kitchen and tried to inventory his body. Something had changed in the roof of his mouth. Pushing a fingertip against it sent a sting up through his cheekbones and into his eyes. The tenderness was in two small, rounded spots. He felt the edges of a pair of swollen nodes. Not quite teeth. Not quite glands. As if his palate had grown a pair of knuckles. He held a small ceramic bowl under his mouth and leaned forward and thought about steak. He didn't have to think long. A trickle of fluid slid down. The smell was sharp and wrong, but it eased the pressure in his head as if he had let out a breath he'd been holding since the crash. In the mirror, he found bloodshot eyes with pinprick pupils. His skin was pale and dry. The bandages pulled at scabbed cuts, and he peeled the edges back. Underneath, the wounds had already skated from raw to a sheen of new skin. The speed of the healing made his scalp sting. Tiny flakes of old skin came away on his fingers and fell into the bowl on the counter, where they fizzed like sugar dropped into soda. The fluid wasn't spit. It wasn't anything he wanted to name. He washed his hands, then dried them and discovered he was hungry again. He tried to be good. He made oatmeal because being good, he thought, was an accumulation of small decisions. He took one bite and almost gagged. He put the bowl in the sink and looked, with shame tight at the base of his neck, back into the refrigerator for more meat. There was a pack of chicken breasts meant for dinner, and he took it to the floor and sat with his back to the cabinet. He tore the plastic with his teeth. The smell was everything he'd been missing, and the heat climbed behind his teeth until he couldn't keep his mouth closed without feeling pain. He decided to wait for Diane. He lasted 20 seconds. His mouth flooded. The fluid touched the crimped edge of the meat and turned it soft, as if the tissue were becoming something drinkable. He didn't want to watch. He didn't want to stop. He chewed and swallowed again until his own skin came with it. He tasted blood and realized it was his. He picked a shard of foam from his teeth and threw the empty package at the trash and missed. He stood and saw himself reflected in a dark square of black TV screen and didn't recognize the man with the hungry mouth and eyes that sat too far back in his skull. He wanted to be someone else. Someone who went to urgent care and rang a bell and waited. He went to the bathroom instead and opened a drawer and took out a nail file from the tray where Diane kept her lipstick and an old pair of tweezers. He watched his hand tremble and said out loud, "This is insane." The voice in the mirror sounded far away. He put the file against one of his front teeth and drew it down. The first scrape made a noise that felt in his bones the way chalk feels on a board if you're the sort who can't stand chalkboards. He pulled the file away and tasted powder. He touched the tooth with the tip of his tongue and felt the roughness and then the sting. He closed his eyes and filed again. Slower. It took forever. And in that forever his mind could only count. He wasn't sculpting monstrosity. He was subtracting imperfection. He made a point of enamel and smiled and saw the pointed tooth and felt the safety of symmetry. He made its partner and then the next pair, pausing only to let more fluid drip from his palate into the sink and rinse the dust from his mouth. By the time he finished, his gums throbbed and his lips were nicked and his mouth tasted like copper and chalk. He wiped his lips with the back of his hand and thought, "This is closer." He called Diane. "Something's wrong," he said. "I don't know what." Her voice changed like a color washed with water. "I'm coming home," she said, and the call ended. He paced the apartment and discovered his clothes no longer fit. He tightened his belt by 2 notches and then by another. He could feel something under his shoulder blades swelling and growing hot. Every time he bent, the pain shot from those 2 spots down his spine in a choice between agony and movement. The heat spread and made sweat stand at the base of his hairline. He was thirsty but didn't want water. He was full but couldn't remember eating. He saw the bowl on the kitchen counter full of the thin yellow fluid, and his stomach turned and his mouth watered. Time broke in half and fell at his feet. He had 9 minutes to wait. Then 7. Then 3. He went to the bathroom to wash his face and found someone in the mirror who had been given a job he didn't want. Greasy hair plastered to a forehead. Dark veins threading a face that had lost its softness overnight. When he wiped at the red at the corners of his mouth, his lip reopened. He was deciding between paper towels and an old hand towel when he heard the front door open. "Mark, I'm home." The words hit him like weather. He looked at the counter. The bowl was still there. He picked it up. He had thought he was the sort of person who could choose not to do terrible things. He had believed fairness was a practice. The fluid arced, a smear that turned the air between him and his wife into a line. It touched her cheek and blossomed. She screamed. He threw the bowl. It broke at her feet. She clapped her hands to her face, and the fluid seeped between her fingers. Mark ran at her without volition. His body had stood up and grabbed the controls and told him to watch. He knocked her to the floor. He felt the heat of her and the warmth of her voice, and something viciously grateful inside him began to uncoil. He sank his teeth into the soft place between her ribs like a man falling onto a bed he has missed. Her voice changed. He swallowed and swallowed. He wanted to stop the same way a man wants to stop a fall after the cliff under him is chosen. He would have prayed if the words would come. You can look away from what you are in the middle of and miss the middle. Mark didn't flinch. He saw the blood. He heard the sound of tissue parting under pressure and the breath that left her. He tasted salt. He kept going because the part of him that knew words was no longer in charge. The part of him that had been waiting since the white-haired girl touched his face took over and would not return the keys. When he was finally, actually full, he couldn't breathe. He had eaten past hunger into hurt. Something at his back tore. He screamed. His voice sounded like it had been sent from another room. The pain was sudden enough to freeze him mid-breath. Then it worsened. The swellings at his shoulder blades opened. An arm, delicate and wrong, pushed out of the split at the seam of skin. Another followed on the other side. They curled and shook like the legs of a newborn deer learning gravity. He felt muscles slide into place where muscles had never been. He watched his own hands lift to help. He tore at the drying skin around the openings and fell forward as the raw new arms unfolded and learned their stretch. Sirens arrived like a decision and grew louder. Neighbors shouted in the hall. Mark sat down hard beside what remained of the woman he had loved and looked at his hands. One pair was old hands, knuckle-scarred from decades of chalk and hauling boxes of papers. The nails too short from being chewed. The new pair trembled. They were soft and uncalloused and a shade of pink he would have called infantile if he had been capable of language. The heat coming off his back began to fade into a fresh ache. He tried to stand and failed. He tried to scream again and could not. He had the presence to consider leaving and discovered that all that lived in him now was a wish to be caught. He had the presence to wonder what the girl with white hair had done to him and discovered that wondering had the same nutritional value as cardboard. He had the presence to regret. That was new. It came back into him like rain. He found that he could still feel love for the people he had destroyed. He had misread many novels as a teacher. He thought. He had called monstrous what was merely difficult. He had called heroic what was only loud. He had assigned papers about the moral life to kids who had not yet had to carry its weight. The feet on the hallway floor got closer. The sirens cut. Somebody with authority tried the knob. When it held, the authority converted to mechanical force. The doorframe cracked. 2 uniformed officers rushed in behind a woman in a dark polo with a badge clipped to her belt. The officers took in what they saw and reacted like men who had been told something terrible about the world and then met it. One gagged. One lifted his weapon and then lowered it to the floor in a flinch. The woman with the badge did not move. Mark lifted one hand. An old one. Palm up. The movement took everything left. He meant it as surrender. He meant it as an apology. He meant it as please. He did not know which the hand communicated. Maybe all. The woman's mouth tightened. Not in disgust, but in pity. She lifted her own hand to stop her officers from moving too quickly. "Mr. Ellison," she said. Her voice was pitched in the center. "Calm enough to stand on. Can you hear me?" He nodded. "It took too long. My name is Agent Mason," she said. "We're going to help you. But I need you to stay down. Do not come toward us. Do not move fast. Do not mouth any fluid at us. Do you understand?" He nodded again and tasted the bitterness of adherence. He lay on his side with his new arms tucked in and his old ones splayed. He saw, past the officer's shoulder, the glow of the kitchen light and the wreckage of a bowl in the doorway. He heard a radio crackle, not the handsets on the officers. Something inside the apartment's walls. It was too faint to be real. He thought he heard a midnight voice cheerfully apologizing for technical difficulties. He thought he heard the word program and the word representative. He thought he saw, through the corner of his eye and through the sliver of the front door, a pale figure in the hallway watching the proceedings. Her hair as white as a fire alarm. "Clear me a path to the subject," Agent Mason said. And two officers did a thing with their shoulders that looked like choreography. Mark tried to focus on her voice. Focus was a rope thrown across a river. And he was tired of water. He chose to be the sort of person who held on anyway. "Big breath in," she said. "Good. Big breath out." He tried to say "I'm sorry." The words wouldn't assemble. He tried to tell them where Lucy was. That she would be home at 2:50 if the bus was on time. That someone needed to be there for her, and it should not be him. Agent Mason glanced into the hallway, and then back at him with eyes that had learned to see two things at once, the person and the fact. Something inside his chest fluttered. He lifted an old hand to press against the feeling. An officer flinched. Agent Mason's voice softened a half-degree. "We're here," she said. "We're here." In the end, the decision was clean. A paramedic in a body armor vest stepped to Mark's side with a case that opened like a book in a church. There was a spray, a needle, a cuff. Someone spoke calmly about airways and breathing. Masks touched his face and pressed. A pair of hands, which pair he couldn't tell, tore at a shirt he thought was his. He reached for something inside him and found a place that could make a choice. "Ma'am," one of the officers said, urgency pushing his voice toward shout. "We need to assume exposure. We need to back out. Look at her. We need to stand down." Agent Mason said, "This is a containment event. That means we do not spread. The neighbor in 3B is on the landing with his phone. You think you can stop that from getting everywhere if we back down now? Stay with me." The word containment scratched an itch in Mark's mind. It sounded like a term you use when a thing has happened before. He was too tired to test that thought. He stared at the door. The pale figure was gone, if it had been there at all. He closed his eyes and saw, not the girl with white hair or Diane's last look, but Lucy at the kitchen table with her backpack open and a pencil tucked behind her ear while she sounded out a word and grinned when she got it right. He opened his eyes. He could not keep the old hands from shaking or the new ones from flexing. He found Agent Mason's face and kept it as a point to sail toward. "Mr. Ellison," she said, "I'm going to give you a dose of something that will slow this. It will not fix it, but it will slow this. I need you to accept that." He nodded. She nodded back. Once. The way people on a road do when they let each other go first. He felt pressure on his arm and the cool glass of a syringe press. The world's edges softened in a way that did not feel like sleep so much as an unsolved math problem put back into a folder. Someone pressed gauze to his arm. Someone else drew air into the room with a hiss that sounded like fear leaving. They strapped his wrists for the ride. They wrapped a band around his chest that made breathing feel like a task inside a task. They brought in a stretcher. The siren outside turned once, twice, then cut. He let them load him. He watched the ceiling roll. He stared into the small squares of tile on the hallway's roof until the squares could have been sky. In the ambulance, Agent Mason sat with her hand on the rail and her eyes on him. "You still with me?" she asked. He nodded. He wanted to say he understood what this cost. He wanted to ask if there was a list of names he could be added to. People like him who had been made into something else by a force that didn't care if they could pay their rent or loved their kid. He wanted to ask if the girl with white hair had ever been a person. He wanted to ask what it meant that he still felt like himself inside something that had used him for a meal. "Tell my daughter," he said. The words were sand. "Tell her I tried to be good." Agent Mason's jaw worked like she was swallowing a stone. "I will tell her," she said, "but I need you to tell her yourself. Stay with me, Mark. Keep your eyes on mine." He did. They rode that way through the gray light of a winter morning in a city that was trying to wake up and failed to. Again and again, until it succeeded by accident. The ambulance turned left, then right, then another right, and the building they pulled up to looked like a hospital, but wasn't called one. A door opened. A hallway swallowed them. The room they brought him to was white in the way only rooms far from windows are white. Time continued to move, which felt like a small mercy. People in gowns and gloves moved around him with the brisk competence of those who knew the steps. He sensed Agent Mason take a breath and change modes. From field to room, like a driver rolling to a stop and shifting into park. A man in a lab coat with age in his hair and impatience at the corners of his eyes began to talk about his blood. He said words like compound and protease and binding. He said exposure. He said ingestion. He said metamorphosis without the romance of scientists who love movie monsters. He said sequence as if he were trying to read him back to himself. When the room slid again and he found himself on a different bed, Mark asked for a phone. Hands hesitated. Agent Mason nodded. They handed him a handset wrapped in a plastic glove. He dialed a number he knew. The call rang through to a voicemail box with a cheerful recorded message. "Lucy," he said. "Pumpkin." He stopped. Found a word that wouldn't turn to glass in his mouth. "There's something wrong with Dad. I am getting help. You are going to be okay. You are going to finish that book about the pony wizard and tell me how it ends, and you are going to correct me when I pronounce your friends' names wrong. I need you to stay with Aunt Renee today and do exactly what she says. Agent Mason will explain. I love you. I try. I always try." He hung up. His arms, all four, lay quiet. He closed his eyes. He expected the midnight DJ to speak in his skull. Instead he heard, faintly, the scratch of winter through a vent. He turned his head an inch and looked at Agent Mason. "Tell me," he said, "is this going to keep happening to people?" She held his gaze. "We are going to do everything we can to make sure it does not," she said. It wasn't an answer so much as a promise. And promises are the cousin of answers when the truth is still in surgery. Mark nodded. It felt like forgiveness for something he had not been asked to explain. He focused on his breath. He made a shape in his mind called a future in which his daughter was an adult and had forgiven him for the parts of her childhood he had ruined. He made a shape called a classroom with a substitute teacher who had turned a test into an essay assignment, and the essays were stacked waiting for him if he got back. He made a shape called a kitchen where the bowl on the counter was filled with fruit and not a story he would never be able to tell. Days went by. He learned how to measure them by the pitch of the air conditioner and the way Agent Mason's hair shadow shifted on the wall when a light down the hall changed. Doctors came in and explained the rate at which his body was attempting to convert him. They said the term inhibitor. They said the term window. They said the word remission like it belonged to a different disease but might rent from it for a while. He tried to listen for the radio voice. The voice did not return. The girl with white hair came to him only in dreams. And in those dreams, she did not look like a monster or a saint. She looked like a girl who had done a job and was cold in the doing of it. He woke each time with Agent Mason's face where the dream face had been, and then with the ceiling's tiles. Then with the click of a nurse's shoe. He learned to tell time by needs. On a Wednesday afternoon, he woke to the sight of a little hand tucked into a bigger one. Lucy stood in the doorway next to his sister-in-law. The girl looked older, which is often what fear does. Agent Mason stood behind them. She had already briefed the room. The people in the gowns stepped out, one by one, like birds leaving a line. "Hey," Mark said. "Hey," Lucy said, and she tried to smile, and it broke his heart and saved it in the same breath. They did not talk about what he had done. There would be time for that. There would be a stack of time, delivered like mail. For now they spoke about school and about a friend who had shown Lucy a trick with a coin and about a pony wizard who turned out to be more than a gimmick. He listened. He held his daughter's hand with his old hand. His new hands lay quiet. He counted each minute like a deposit. He would, to the end of his life, carry what had happened in the apartment. He would carry the fact of the radio and the girl with winter for hair and the way hunger can take a man and use him as an instrument. He would carry the memory of the officer lowering his weapon because there are times when what the world needs is a person who will not choose noise. He would carry the knowledge that if we cannot be spared from what is monstrous, we can at least choose to be human while it's happening. The treatment worked enough to give him a life. Not the life he had imagined. But no one gets that. He never returned to the old classroom. He taught 2 nights a week at the community center and pretended that fell into a plan he had always secretly held. He learned to hold a mug without the new hands trembling. He learned to go to the store at off hours. He learned to look down a hallway and not see a pale figure at the end of it. He learned to cook again. Slowly. He learned that love is sometimes a series of small rituals you perform to honor ghosts. He never kept bowls on the counter. Agent Mason came by once a month. She sat at his table and drank the tea he insisted on brewing and asked about books. He asked her, more than once, if there had been others. She did not always answer. When she did, she said only that the world was big and that the best measure of whether something terrible is spreading is how quickly good people get organized. He accepted that as the sort of answer you get when the truth is still living through its testing period. On the 1-year anniversary of the morning the owl hit his windshield, he drove to the edge of the city before dawn and parked on the shoulder and stood in the weak light with a thermos in his hand. He watched the flat ribbon of road and the field beyond it and waited for something that looked like a sign. Nothing showed. Sometimes that is the point. He turned and went home before the traffic began. He did not believe he had been chosen. He believed he had been unlucky and then loved anyway. When he felt the heat behind his teeth, he chewed gum and called someone. When he felt the itch beneath his shoulder blades, he lay flat on the floor until it passed, counting backwards from 100 by threes. Because Diane had once read in some magazine that this was a way to interrupt the panic cycle. And you keep the practices that work, no matter where you found them. He kept telling the truth about himself as far as it could be told. He did not tell it to YouTube. He told it to the therapist Agent Mason found, and to Lucy as she was able to bear it, and to the mirror when the mirror seemed to be offering the bargain of becoming someone easier. He learned how to be a man with 4 arms who kept the new ones under a jacket and used the old 2 for cooking and carrying and turning pages. He learned how to be not eligible for a program, but volunteer to be a person. At night, when the apartment settled and the city quieted, he sometimes heard the end of a trumpet solo break the silence, as if someone somewhere were finishing the song he had interrupted. He would wait for the DJ's voice, and then it would not come. He would lay a hand on the kitchen table, an old hand. The right one. The one that had graded so many essays, and count the rings in the wood, and decide that the absence of the voice was not abandonment, but mercy. He was not forgiven by the world. The world doesn't do forgiveness. Not in a way that settles the account. He was forgiven, sometimes and not always, by the people who mattered. He forgave himself the way a craftsman forgives a tool for having the potential to hurt. He did not absolve himself. He learned to live with two facts at once. He had been used by whatever had stepped off the shoulder of the road, and he had been the one who opened his mouth. Years later, he would sit at the back of a room where Lucy stood in a gown that made him think of bridges and weather. She would say into a microphone that she had decided to specialize in transitional justice, and he would have to look the term up later to fully understand it. And he would think, that's right. That's the profession of our age, moving between what we did and what we will do now, and making the bridge out of the only material we have, which is each other. He would drive her home after the ceremony and stop for diner food and tell the waitress, when she asked if he wanted coffee, that yes, please, he wanted coffee. He would look out the window and see, for a fraction of a second, a figure across the street in the reflection, a young woman with white hair, skin like winter, eyes that refused light. He would blink and she would not be there. He would take a sip of coffee and decide that the work of living is not to catalog omens, but to practice decency when omens are stubborn. When he woke the next morning, there would be the smallest ache at the roof of his mouth and the smallest itch between his shoulder blades. Reminders of a story that did not end so much as find a better chapter break. He would go into the kitchen and make eggs too slowly, because slowness is a ritual of peace, and plate them for his daughter and for himself. He would open the window and let in enough cold to remind them it was winter, and they were in a city that had both violence and mercy written into the seams of its days. He would sit. He would eat. He would consider the work of the morning. He would keep choosing. If you made it to the end, I'd love to hear your thoughts. What do you make of a world where violence can be both monstrous and mundane, and where ordinary people carry the bill for injustices they never ordered? Is punishment enough, or does justice ask for something stranger and harder? Share your take in the comments, especially on how we should balance accountability and mercy when people are changed by forces beyond their control. Your voice matters here. Take a stand and tell us where you draw the line.